All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Susie Vetter from Rhodes University. You probably have met me by now. And it's my privilege to chair the fire ecology session on this last day of our 60th Congress. And what better way to kick off a fire ecology session at a Congress very much designed to celebrate 60 years of our society's history than to introduce our keynote speaker, Lynne Trollope, one half of the indomitable and famous fire ecology duo of Trollope and Trollope, Winston and Lynne Trollope. Winston's research on fire ecology needs no introduction really, but it has been close to 60 years. So for as long as our society has been around, in fact, his fire research predates the establishment of our society, and Winston was one of the founding fathers of our grassland society. Winston and Lynne were married for 54 years, and it took the society a while, but it started dawning on us that she wasn't just his wife and inseparable companion, but very much a collaborator in these many decades of research. She decided early on that if you can't fight them, join them. And between them, they have worked in fire research on every continent and set fires on every continent, I think, with the exception of Antarctica. So I will not steal any more of Lynne's time. She's got 58 of research to squeeze into 20 minutes. So over to you. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. On Tuesday, I was introduced to, I think it's called Chatbox GBT. And I looked up GSSA Congress and it's all there. So what am I doing here? But I can't let Susie and Justin down, so I'll carry on. So thank you to the organizers of the conference for the privilege of sharing the details of the ribbon of fire in my life. Oh, excuse me. I could tell you about fighting off black flies and the extensive lightning fires in the boreal forests of Canada above the Arctic Circle. I could tell you about chasing goats from morning to evening, documenting their every nibble in the broken alpine mountainsides of Norway, coping with the Russian Forestry Service, hospitality, and copious amounts of raw homemade vodka in Siberia, the Przewalski horses on the Mongolian grasslands, burning for tigers in India, being saved from a black widow spider bite by a chivalrous fellow scientist in the outback of Australia, dodging lions, rhinos, and elephants while doing surveys on foot, and working in the Kruger National Park and many other parts of the world. But then you wouldn't learn anything of academic value about fire. So let me return to Winston's favorite title and topic, Fire in African Savannas, and tell you a bit about the research we did. Fire has been mankind's companion and foe since the dawn of time. It's a real challenge from fire to understand it and the earth we live on. It's important to consider type and intensity of fire, plus season and frequency of burning. Fire is one of the principal determinants of African structure and composition of African savanna vegetation, and it's a landscape. This landscape is a product of fire, plus variations in climate, soil, and herbivory. In the Kruger National Park, there's a fire and herbivory experiment. On the left is fire and elephants, and you can see the outcome there. And the exclusion plot on the right is fire and no elephants. But we have to acknowledge humans and fire, and humans have become more important than lightning sources as sources of ignition. The KNP data from 1980 to 1992 shows that anthropogenic fires are more important than lightning fires. Now, going towards a season of burning at the University of Protea experiments, summer burns rapidly and markedly deleted grass cover that increased at herbaceous forbs. The recommendation thus is to burn when the grass is dormant if you want to maintain a good grass cover. So the legacy of fire in savannas is to influence the structure and structural dominance of trees. And this has implications for carbon sequestration. Now the Nwanedzi plots in Zatara, which I'm sure anybody has worked in Kruger know, on the left in the mid distance, the trees right behind are not actually in the plots. And the biennial burn plot, the trees are actually there, but they're not evident because of the impact of fire. The control plot on the right has had 6 decades of no fire. Bush encroachment is another aspect. It's become a major problem for livestock farmers and wildlife managers, resulting in degraded rangelands with reduced carrying capacities and concomitant economic losses. 2 of the main encroaching species, Dichrostachys cinerea in South Africa and Senegalia mellifera in Namibia. So Winston's assessment was the primary reasons based on long-term fire trials at the University of Protea in South Africa is that incorrect grazing and browsing management and the lack of or inappropriate fire management is the primary reason. Elevated levels of CO2 should therefore be considered as a secondary rather than a primary cause of bush encroachment. At his experiments at the fire and browsing experiment at the University of Protea, on the top left, the plot was burnt at that initial burn and the resultant coppice growth after the burn. The bottom right is the same plot in 2002, same initial burn, and 30 years browsing by goats at the correct stocking rate. So the recommendations for prescribed burning for controlling bush encroachment is a cost-effective and ecologically sensitive fire management practice. But this must be based on specific weather parameters and ecological criteria. In other words, the 30-30-30 principle, temperatures greater than 30 degrees, relative humidity less than 30%, wind speed less than 30 meters per second, and a grass biomass of 4,000 kilograms per hectare. It's costly and ecologically potentially harmful herbicides or mechanical control methods impact negatively on our environment. Fire and bush encroachment in moist savannas, high intensity fire controls bush encroachment. In arid savannas, fire reduces the size and structure of trees and shrubs and maintains the woody vegetation at an available height and palatable state for browsing animals. So fire and tree mortality, research results in several African ecosystems indicate that bush is very resistant to fire alone. In the Eastern Cape, the mortality of bush after a high intensity fire was only 9.9%. In the Kruger National Park, the average mortality of the 14 of the most common tree species subjected to 43 fires was only 1.3%. Now we turn to invasive alien plants. Chromalina odorata in KwaZulu-Natal, more than 103 million rand has been spent, and in fact, I think now it's much more, on control and Umfolozi Game Reserve, but it regenerates within 2 to 3 years without follow-up treatments. We found that fire could be used for controlling chromalina. We had the plot on the left is pre-burn chromalina encroachment, and we had a 78% mortality when the fire was applied under a high fire danger index of 53. You can have an effect, but it's much lower, at 27% mortality when applied under the lower FDI of 38. Another encroaching plant is Seriphium plumosum. We've heard about that in the lecture so far. Depending on where you live, it's referred to bankrupt bush or slungbush, and it's an indigenous plant invading vast areas of grassland in South Africa. And from our research results of about 10 years, the use of fire to convert old moribund bankrupt bush into palatable fodder for livestock will enable the rehabilitation of vast areas of degraded rangeland in southern Africa. We turn to ticks and fire, the Maasai traditional pastoralists in Tanzania, and they use fire to control ticks. They graze their cattle in biennially burnt areas with less than 3,000 kilograms per hectare, but that of course depends on the rainfall they've had. We found that in moribund Chloris guyana, it provided ideal microclimate for ticks. And in the early 2000s, 1,000 buffalo died of babesiosis in the Ngorongoro crater. And when we did the research there, the buffalo were frequently found in areas of more than 4,000 kilograms per hectare. And this is ideal habitat. When one walked out of there, his pants were just brown with ticks. So the question should be asked, is prescribed fire, can it be used for controlling ticks? Tourism and trophy hunting contributes 28 billion rand annually to the South African economy. Ticks and tick-borne diseases are a very real challenge to the game ranches and private game reserves, and it is difficult and expensive to apply arachnicides to wild animals. So prescribed fire could be a more cost-effective control for ticks. Fire in fynbos, it was early attempts to save the marsh rose from extinction that taught conservationists that fire was essential for fynbos. Also, you have geophytic plant species like Satanthus fire lilies flower only once after a fire and become latent until the next fire goes through. And many species have been rediscovered after wildfires. Some even, they have been thought to be extinct, some even after 108 years. And if you go into the literature, you find many species they document that have reappeared after wildfires. So fire has left many legacies in the global ecosystem over time. It is our duty to appreciate, understand, and protect these legacies. We go back to bush encroachment. High intensity fires are required for controlling bush encroachment, but require extreme weather condition for the fires to have a significant effect. The fire danger indices of 60 to 70%, or otherwise orange conditions, are dangerous and have a high fire risk, requiring exceptionally well-trained manpower and adequate fire suppression equipment available. We then investigated multiple ignitions. High FDI weather conditions result in the increased possibility of wildfires developing with resultant litigation costs. And now, I was chatting to Tony Palmer, and he was saying that insurers are increasingly unwilling to insure against fire damage due to all the major fires in Australia and California. So the use of multiple ignition capsules would result in higher intensity fires being safely achieved under lower FDIs of 50 to 55, with the potential for spotting being significantly reduced. We researched two types of multiple ignitions, which we compared with the conventional perimeter ignition pattern. On the top left is a spiral ignition pattern, and on the right is a racecourse or zigzag ignition pattern where helicopters drop the multiple ignitions. So the analysis of the data showed that these racecourse and spiral ignition patterns generated a much higher fire intensity under the lower FDI conditions. So these results were further investigated in field trials in July, August 2013 in the Zulu-Nyala Private Game Reserve in KwaZulu-Natal. And there we introduced the char height measurements, the char height caused by fire on the stems and branches of the trees. And this measurement technique was developed in Australia. And there is a positive relationship between char height and fire intensity. That is, the higher the char height, the greater the fire intensity. And this graph shows char heights versus fire intensity, and you definitely get far higher char heights and effect on your bush and the higher FDI conditions. We then, another exciting venture we went into was the development of open-ended fire breaks. And these were researched and developed using, again, aerial ignition capsules. And the application of all the research we did on open-ended fire breaks was that 62 kilometers of fire breaks ignited using a helicopter and ignition capsules was done in the Drakensberg in the Matatiel district in 44 minutes. And the next morning on the surveys, about 100-meter wide fire break was burned. But I must add, weather conditions are absolutely critical for this. And then a helicopter to do a follow-up survey and douse the odd hotspots in deep ravines and that. And then you can safely apply this technology. So in conclusion, considering the legacy of fire, excuse me, in African grasslands and savannas over time has highlighted the significant ecological role fire plays in molding and functioning these ecosystems in Africa. So the motto that one always used is, excuse me, fire a bad master but a good servant. Oh, losing my voice. And my advice is follow your dreams. We did. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for that fantastic talk. 58 years of pushing back the frontiers of ignorance in the service of actual management. I think there's few people who can make that claim to fame. And they were also the joint recipients of the Prestige Award from the Society at our 50th Congress 10 years ago. We've got time for a couple of questions, if there are.
Only one, Susan.
All right, only one, and that would be Earth.
Thanks for that lovely talk, Lynn. It's really great. No need to be nervous.
I didn't dare look at you after your comments last night.
We won't ask.
You thought I'd be a cabbage or what? One of the interesting things you pointed out was the air temperature of greater than 30 degrees. But there's also been some evidence that air temperature isn't that critical. More important is the dryness of the fuel load and the amount of fuel load. So even under fairly cool conditions, you can get a very intense fire. And so Drakensberg, for example, did some work in Texas where, we found that air temperature is one of those things that's often quoted, but is actually not that fundamental to getting intense fire. I don't know if you have any ideas about that.
I think Matthew Danckwerts might be able to back me up, but it seems that relative humidity is a really critical parameter in controlling the intensity and the spread of fires. Biomass state is also good. It's difficult to burn very green grass. So if it's a sort of medium dryness to dry, you definitely get faster moving fires and more fire intensity if you use the right weather conditions.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
You can enjoy and relax the last half a day of the Congress. Our next presenter is speaking to us from the University of Florida and will be online. It's Carissa Wonkka, who will be talking about the effects of the interaction effects of fire and grazing on Seriphium plumosum, and that one should be no stranger. We've heard quite a lot about Slangbos, aka bankrupt bush. So I'm going to hand over to Zoom. Are our technical people on it? Did she submit a pre-recorded presentation? Are you happy for me to go to the next speaker while this is? Okay. All right. We seem to be back on track, so.
Hello. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there with you all in person, particularly as the temperature here in Florida was up to 43 degrees with the heat index today. But I am very glad to have the opportunity to present our songbus research with you all. Before I begin, I just want to thank my co-authors, Michelle Clark and Drs. Urs Kreuter and William Rogers, without whom none of this research would have been possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the background and problems that occur with bankrupt bush, including some of its characteristics, and then describe a study to you that we conducted to assess some potential management options for controlling bankrupt bush. And then we will talk a little bit about limitations of that study and hopefully be able to think about some implications in future research directions. As all of you who work in and around rangelands globally know, woody plant encroachment is a global issue that impacts rangelands worldwide. Often it reduces land values and ecosystem service delivery. It definitely reduces grazing capacity and can also alter biodiversity of both plants and wildlife in rangelands that are encroached by woody plants. In South Africa, Seriphium plumosum, otherwise known as bankrupt bush or songbus, is a major encroacher into rangelands, threatening ecological and economic integrity of rangelands across South Africa. Given its problematic status, we conducted a study to explore the interactive effects of prescribed fire and livestock grazing as potential management strategies for Seriphium plumosum. Seriphium plumosum thrives in sandy and fertile soils, and it can form dense mats. It has very densely bunched vegetation, thus allowing it to shade out grass species that would come in and around it if it were not there. And these dense mats make it mechanically difficult to remove. Fire and grazing are historical ecological processes throughout the range of Seriphium plumosum, but their effectiveness in controlling it remains unclear, and some early studies have shown them to be fairly ineffective. We wanted to look at these interactive effects of fire and grazing on songbus, and so we conducted a study at Ukulima Farm in Limpopo Province, South Africa. We established 16 10-meter by 10-meter plots and assigned them randomly to one of 4 treatments. Our 4 treatments were a grazing exclosure, an unburned, a grazing exclosure with burned plots, grazing access but not burned, or grazing access and burned. Data were collected before treatments were conducted, 6 months after treatment, and 2 years following treatment. This is just a schematic of the study site showing you the location of Ukulima Farm in Limpopo Province, and then the layout of Ukulima Farm itself, as well as our pastures location within the farm. And finally, on the far right-hand side of the screen, our experimental design is represented there heuristically with the treatments labeled. Ring fires were applied in the burned plots on July 12th of 2012 during the dry winter season. Our attempt was to reduce Seriphium plumosum canopy and height with these single ring fires. Cattle were allowed to resume grazing immediately in the unfenced plots after burning, and the grazing rotations lasted 14 days during December, February, and May of 2013 and 2014. We collected information on shrub height, canopy area, stem number, and percentage cover, all visually estimated. And we did this in June 2012, January 2013, and June 2014, so immediately before fire, 6 months after, and 2 years after. We use repeated measures ANOVA to test the effects of fire, grazing, time, and their interactions on some of the Seriphium plumosum characteristics, as well as herbaceous vegetation metrics. So just to dive into some results, I'd like to share these figures with you. So you can see our sampling period is down on the bottom on the x-axis with our pretreatment, followed by our 6 months following fire, and then our 2 years following fire. There were no significant interactions between fire and grazing, so we assessed fire and grazing as main effects. In these figures, grazing is represented by circles, and fire is represented by triangles. And as you can see, for both Seriphium plumosum cover and canopy area, there was an initial effect of fire in the 6 months following fire sampling period, but that effect was basically erased by 2 years following fire for both cover and canopy area. Canopy area remained a little bit lower in burned plots than unburned plots, but this was not statistically significant. Grazing had no effect on canopy cover or canopy area. We also looked at stem count and height. You can see that for stem count in the sampling period 6 months after fire, stem count was increased in burned plots, but then by 2 years following fire, all plots had the same number of stems, and grazing had no effect. And then height was reduced by fire in the 6 month sampling period, but again, that difference was eroded in the 2 years since fire sampling period. And although the burned plots still remained slightly lower, on average, this was not a significant difference, and grazing had no impact on either stem count or height. So just to break things down by fire versus grazing, fire significantly reduced shrub height, canopy area, and cover initially, but no significant shrub mortality occurred, and regrowth was observed within 2 years, such that there were no longer significant differences from fire. Grazing alone had minimal impacts on shrub characteristics, suggesting that the palatability of Seriphium plumosum remains low after fire, does not increase in forage palatability. However, some observations that we made suggest that cattle may begin browsing Seriphium plumosum during periods when other forage quality is low, such as during drought. So there's potential that targeted grazing during these periods might increase the impact of grazing on Seriphium plumosum. We also wanted to look at herbaceous community response to our fire and grazing treatments. Again, there was no interaction between fire and grazing, so we're looking at main effects. And similar to Seriphium cover, total grass cover decreased in burned plots in the 6 months following fire sampling period, but then by 2 years following fire, those differences had eroded and the plots, both burned and unburned, were the same. Grazing had no impact on total grass cover in the long term either, with both grazed and ungrazed plots being at the same level 2 years following fire. And then total forb cover increased in the burned plots in 6 months after fire sampling period, but then it reduced back to similar to unburned in 2 years following fire sampling period. Similarly, the ungrazed plots actually had higher forb cover than the grazed plots 6 months following fire, but again, that treatment difference eroded over time until they were not different 2 years following fire. We also wanted to look at biomass and diversity. So fire did not significantly alter grass biomass or diversity in the long term. Grazing exclusion increased herbaceous biomass, but plant diversity remained unchanged. And the dominant grass species showed mixed responses to fire and grazing, with Eragrostis curvula cover decreasing after fire, Aristida congesta increasing, and other dominant species remaining unaffected. So to think about these results, fire can temporarily reduce Seriphium plumosum stature and cover, but it does not eliminate the shrub. Grazing could potentially enhance shrub palatability post-fire, but the effectiveness of that will depend on forage quality and grazing intensity. Long-term management might require repeated fire applications and careful integration of grazing practices to control Seriphium plumosum over the long term because of Seriphium plumosum's resilience through basal resprouting and seedling recruitment to fire. And prescribed fire is a pretty cost-effective tool for altering shrub structure, but clearly here, follow-up treatments will be required for sustained control, since we only saw 6-month responses that were erased by 2 years following fire. Sustainable grazing practices could be evaluated to balance shrub control and forage availability, including looking at timing of grazing following fire and potentially the impacts of grazing during times when other forage quality is low. And one other important point to note is that we were working in fairly infertile areas, and that could have an impact on the herbaceous response that we saw. And so soil type and environmental conditions should be considered when designing these management strategies. In conclusion, while fire and grazing show promise for reducing Seriphium plumosum density, neither alone is sufficient to reverse encroachment. However, our study only evaluated the effects of fire and grazing over a 2-year period, which does not likely capture long-term dynamics of Seriphium plumosum invasion and the impacts of management on that. Only one prescribed fire was applied, limiting our potential to have insights into the effectiveness of repeated fire treatments for sustained shrub control. In addition, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the study cites sandy, infertile soils may have influenced the limited response of herbaceous vegetation to treatments, potentially reducing competition between newly emerging herbaceous species and the resprouting Seriphium plumosum. Therefore, if we were to potentially conduct these experiments in more fertile soils, we could see a stronger interaction between the fire and grazing, as well as see a greater competition with Seriphium plumosum from grasses following fire, and potentially a better outcome for prescribed burning on Seriphium plumosum management. So therefore, our studies potentially not generalizable to more fertile soils, and soil type and fertility should be considered in thinking about these impacts of fire and grazing. So future research should focus on repeat fire applications, potentially fire timing, grazing impacts, including the timing of grazing relative to forage quality and availability, and maybe some environmental characteristics like drought in the post-fire environment, and then interactions with soil characteristics such as fertility and texture that might be influencing the impact of fire and grazing on Seriphium plumosum. And I'd just like to acknowledge Ukalima Farm Research Center staff and the funding that we received from the Howard Buffett Foundation that made this study possible. We had some excellent field assistance by several people listed here. And then also I'd like to acknowledge the important studies that set us up to do this and form the background for our interest in Seriphium plumosum. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at cwonkka@ufl.edu. And I look forward to hearing any questions or comments or potential future directions for research. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the much cooler weather there and the rest of the conference. I wish I could be there with you all in person.
Right. While staying international, our next speaker is joining us in person all the way from Benin, Elodiade Houindote, from the Université Devan Mc Millan, and he's talking about impact of early season fires. She's talking in a reserve in Benin. Please, the floor is yours. There's your timekeeping.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this presentation. Today, I'm so nervous because the English is not my native language, and so I'm so nervous. Okay. I'm PhD student at Laboratory of Ecology Applied in University of Abomey-Calavi in Benin in West Africa. So today, the subject that I want to talk about is impact of early fire on vegetation dynamic in the Pendjari Biosphere Reserve in Benin. So, fire is a natural ecological driver in African savanna. It plays many roles in ecosystem. It shapes landscape, maintains ecological balance, and controls plant growth. However, the two frequencies of intense fire can have many negative effects. For example, where the fire is too frequent, it limits the regeneration of plants, cause damage for ecosystem, and reduce biodiversity. In the world, Africa have the largest part of savanna ecosystem, so many studies have focused on understanding fire in order to support more effective management strategies. In West Africa, few studies that look at the long-term impact of frequent fire. So these are sometimes difficult to manage that properly and protect our ecosystem. It is the reason my study focused on frequent early fire in Pendjari Biosphere Reserve. In fact, every year, early fire make in Pendjari Biosphere for many reasons. We use the early fire to forage availability, also for wildlife view and tourism. So the study wants to improve the management of early fire in the Pendjari Biosphere Reserve. Specifically, we want to assess fire frequency and local perception in reserve and analyze vegetation dynamic with modest NDVI data in 2 periods. So the study area, the Pendjari Biosphere Reserve is located in Benin, northern Benin, in West Africa. We have grassy savanna, shrubby, wooded gallery forest. In terms of fauna, we have the big four, like buffalo, elephant, lion, and cheetah. So, to assess fire frequency and local perception, we download modest satellite imagery over 19-year period in the reserve and make a local resident survey to understand local perception of the impact of repetitive early fire on plant species. The results show that early fire is the most commonly used fire regime in the reserve. So according to local perception, the frequency of early fire has negative on certain species. So to compare the result with the real data, we are analyze vegetation dynamic with data MODIS. So we are collected MODIS collection burn area and the MODIS Terra NDVI and make specifically NDVI image of burn area of Pendjari. With this data, we are make the spatial temporal dynamic of vegetation in reserve and also predictive effect of fire with ARIMA, autoregressive integrity moving average. So the results show over 2,000 year periods. Here is 2001 and here is 2023. Over period, dense vegetation progressively diminish in favor of species, spatial formation in region regularly exposed to early repetitive fire. The predictive fire show NDVI value are decreasing and tend towards zero from 2025 to 2050. So the result of this research confirms the negative effect of frequent early fire on plant biodiversity, supporting previous study on the impact of fire regime in savanna. What is the implication for conservation, specifically for Pendjari Biosphere Reserve? We are shown in this study that frequent early fire have negative impact on plant biodiversity in reserve. So fire management must be adapted to the ecological dynamic of the savanna. Rotational burning systems are essential to avoid repetitive exposure of the same area. This approach can help stabilize forest diversity. It will also help prevent long-term degradation of plant communities. So, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elodiade, for that, bringing us the Western African savannas. And we've got time for a couple of questions. Anyone? Yes.
Sorry, I might have missed the point in your talk, but can you just explain to us what you mean by early season fires in relative to your seasons? Yeah.
Did you understand it? He wants to know what is meant by early season. How's it relating to like spring, summer, or wet season, dry season?
Okay. The early fire is fire we are put to in the end for rainy season to have a forage availability for the fodder.
All right, thank you so much. Next up is Matthew Danckwerts, who is local, born and bred in the Eastern Cape and active in fire research and consulting. So he'll be telling us a little bit about some useful measures in fire forensics.
Thanks for the introduction, Susie. So, I wanted to start with this, this picture, and Heidi might recognize it. It showed up in one of her talks a few years ago, and there were a few things that caught my attention when I saw it. Yeah, it's just quite interesting how people think. So if I had to ask the audience now, what is the first thing that catches your eye, or what do you notice? You'd probably say something like veldfire. since it's a grassland society, maybe people will comment on the species of grasses or the veld condition. But when I look at it, the first thing I see is there's a backfire burning into the wind. The smoke is blowing over the burnt ground, just to corroborate that it's a backfire. And then the interesting thing, I don't know if my picture can move there, but there are grass calms, unburnt grass calms lying on the burnt ground. Now, why are they unburnt? That's just an example of the grass calms, not seen in that picture, but elsewhere. And as you can see, undercut, it's unburnt and it's lying on burnt veld. So what is this phenomenon we're seeing? Some of you are familiar with my talks, have probably seen the schematic a few times. That as we have a backfire, which burns into the wind or downslope, its flames will lean over the burnt ground. And the base of the flames will first make contact with the unburnt fuel at the base of the grass sward. It'll allow the calms then to either fall over or be blown over by the wind and land on the burnt ground. When we have a head fire, that doesn't happen. So a fire that spreads with the wind or upslope, so just ignore the arrow at the top, the flames will lean into the unburned fuel and consume the grass calm. So we, there's just examples. So we, okay, sorry, what about this slide? This is a dead giveaway. As you can see, that's the bottom of the grass calm, and you can see it's burnt or charred at the base of the grass calm. So it's not lying there for any other reason. It was burnt at its base and it fell over the flames. So we set out to just empirically test this because it's just anecdotal knowledge in the literature. And we did this in 7 landscape scale fires in some self-fault areas in the montane areas in the Eastern Cape. We had 141 10 by 10 meter plots across those 7 landscape scale fires, so about 20 plots per fire. And we recorded the fire types, so head, back, or flank fire, into the wind, against the wind, or perpendicular to the wind, and the direction through each plot, so the direction in relation to north. And then we also counted the number of unburnt calms. Just the burning procedure for those interested, you start on the downwind side of the paddock or experimental burn plot, and I think most people are familiar with this who are involved in fire. And you put in a backfire, and then you go along the flanks and then put in a head fire. And if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see there's a big portion of the experimental burn plot that is a backfire, but also a nice big portion that's a nice intense head fire. So you get a good distribution amongst your plots. That's just a schematic to kind of show what that looks like. Again, backfire put in over there along the back, and then down the flanks, and then a head fire in there. And nice distribution, even distribution amongst your plots. So what did we find? Well, quite striking actually. We found that undercut grass calms are an almost unequivocal feature of backfires. We had one instance of a head fire that had calms in it, and it was probably because of a misrecording, or maybe there was a fluctuation in wind direction in the short period of time. So it was a head fire that went through, but there was a lull in the wind or something. And then we've also got some in flank fires as well. Now, those who are familiar with fire behavior will know that flank fires are actually just either head fires or backfires, which fluctuate according to their position behind the wind. So if the wind is behind the flank fire, it behaves more like a head fire, and vice versa. Okay, I'll just show that. Just one last thing, that the absence of calms on burnt ground isn't necessarily an indicator of a head fire, because the calms might not have been present in the sward before the fire passed. So that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so just a schematic. If we've got a fire scar, a rough one, and we find a lot of calms in one area, then we can separate it and say, that's not doing its thing. There we go. We can separate it, and we can say that we have got some backfires over there. We had head fire spread or advancing fire spread over there. And therefore, the fire must have started, X marks the spot. Nice and easy. Just interesting note, this can also happen in reeds. So yeah, not just grass calms. It can happen in larger plants as well. Okay, so what if we could determine the direction the backfire approached from by looking at the direction the calms are lying on the burnt veld? So just a note here, there are obviously a different number of calms found in each plot, and they're also pointing in different directions. So you've got to be mindful not to lose that variation when doing analyses, and most circular statistics don't support weighted data, so you've got to find clever ways of getting around that. So if we take the calm direction for just relative to north, for all the landscape scale fires, we get a nice even distribution. That's what we'd expect from having fires or wind directions from various different directions. And you can do a Rayleigh test, which is like a test for normality in circular statistics, which shows that, which will either determine whether the distribution is evenly distributed or whether there's a unimodal distribution towards one direction. But what we can also do is look at the direction the calms are lying relative to wind. And if we do that, we get quite striking results again. And we'll see that over there, that's downwind. So the calms are pointing downwind. So they were blown by the wind and fell over the flames, pointed away. So what's the significance of this? Well, it allows us to walk through a fire scar, look at the calms, and see where the fire approached from. So just same idea, except I've now just aligned those little calms and pointed them towards the origin. So just what is the significance of these results? A lot of you ecologists might wonder, what on earth am I talking about? Why is this relevant? Firstly, there's a whole field of fire forensics, and it's really growing in the recent years. We're having our first conference in November, and people are starting to publish fire forensics for the first time. So that's really important, has a lot of significance in terms of insurance claims, litigation, etc. But there's also a lot of potential for practical applicability, and yeah, maybe we could use grass calms in more academic work as an easy kind of way to work out where backfires were and where head fires were. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Do we have a question? Yes, at the back. I can only see the hand, not the person.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I just have a quick question. It might be quite basic, but does the fire behave the same way? I mean, like the direction of the calms or the grasses or whatever was burning, does it behave the same way, or does the same framework that you just presented apply when it comes to change of direction? especially if you're going to find in these areas, maybe kloofs or mountainous areas with the creation of microclimates. Do you see the same regime or the same behavior in terms of how the grasses are lying and stuff like that?
Well, fires behave very differently based on wind direction. So backfires have very small flames, like in that opening picture. Headfires, much larger flames. They're burning into the fuel. So if you're talking about just in that sense, they behave very, very differently. You won't have the calms and the headfires. In different regimes or in different areas, I'd say slope can have an effect on fire spread type and can influence the direction the calms can fall. It can influence the direction the flames lean, which influences fire behavior. I hope that answers your question.
Urs, and then the much shorter person in front of Urs.
Thanks for that. So Lynn said that, maybe I should ask you the question that I asked her. So does air temperature matter other than the extent to which it affects relative humidity when you're thinking about fire intensity?
I think you just answered the question. You didn't mention that in the first, when you posed it to Lynn, but yes, its extent to which it influences relative humidity is its biggest influence. You're quite correct. Air temperature doesn't have that much of an effect on fire behavior. In grasslands especially, it's humidity, relative humidity, that is the big thing. The cured grasses, which are grasses which burn, they equalize with relative humidity within a few hours. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Sue?
Thanks. I may have missed it, but I'm very curious about pyrogenic carbon. And is there an opportunity to use this sort of as a way to look at litter left over from different kinds of fire and relating that back to the extent of the litter that's burnt and pyrogenic carbon into soil? Sort of a methodological advance or something?
Litter's a different thing. These are unburnt calms, which are quite large, and you notice them on the veld, but the partially burnt litter you see on the veld, on the burnt veld, is different. And I've actually got work on that as well. Yes, there's a correlation, or in different fire spread types, you get different amounts of litter, and the results are significant. But that doesn't apply to the calms. Yes, it is still litter in the system.
Thank you. Anybody else? Right, I think you're off the hook. Thanks again. Our next speaker is Londiwe Gule, who works with SAON, and she's going to be telling us about the effect of microhabitat variation on demographic parameters of Protea roupelliae in the Drakensberg. And as someone who has a soft spot for demography, I'm very excited to hear about that.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Susie, for the introduction. So basically, we're looking at, is there enough microhabitat for Proteas to hang on if the fires are to increase with global change? Okay, so the Protea roupelliae is a species of Protea, Proteaceae, it's the Proteaceae family. They grow to be 3 to 8 meters tall, and they live for about 50 to 70 years, and they have a robust bark as well as an expansive crown. Sorry about my voice. And it's a keystone species in the southern Drakensberg because it forms savanna-like stand communities in the grassland with C4 grasses. It also grows on rocky ridges and shallow soils. And because it's a tree in the grasslands, it increases the biodiversity or animal biodiversity, and it supports birds like sugar birds. And I don't know if you can see there's one that we spotted, a Mashalata sugar bird there. And it also hosts other invertebrates in that montane ecosystem. So why Protea roupelliae? Well, unlike other Protea species, it does not resprout or store seeds. So it's not very well adapted to survive in a fire ecosystem. And it has to coexist with other Protea species that are well adapted in a fire ecosystem and need fire, especially the grassland. We all know grasslands need fire to survive. So how it survives fire, it survives through apical buds that lay dormant in winter, and those apical buds are protected by thick foliage. And the juveniles are highly vulnerable to frequent fires because they have to grow enough to be out of the grass sward, it's called. And if the fires are too frequent, there's just not enough recruitment happening for the juveniles. So the aim of this project is to examine the population dynamics of Protea roupelliae to determine the impact of microhabitat variability in the demographic parameters of the species. And what demographic parameters are we looking at? The survival. How many are surviving after a certain period of time or after a fire? The mortality. How many are dying after a certain time? Recruitment. How many are growing to join the adults in the growth? We're looking at the population structure. How many individuals generally are there, as well as the growth rate. The objective of the study is to investigate the role of rocks, focusing on the effectiveness of rocks in reducing the fire severity of the damage on the trees. It's to compare fire intensities throughout the years, and to measure those key demographic parameters I mentioned, and record juvenile survival and growth as well as adult survivals. We have two predictions. We predict that trees near rocks will have less fire damage, higher survival rates, and a greater reproductive success, as well as juvenile recruitment is higher in rocky microhabitats. So where are we doing all of this? So if you're familiar with the Sunny Pass, that's the Sunny Pass Road. And you have 3 plots there that are high altitude. And you have another 3 here that are at low altitude. The Sunny Pass is located in Ukahlaba Drakensberg Park in the southern Drakensberg. The plot starts from an elevation of 1,800 meters and they go up in elevation. The vegetation in the area is classified as a highland grassland dominated by seafall grasses, and the area has seasonal fires, there's frost, underbatic winds, and 84% of the rainfall falls in summer. So where are we doing this? So we have these generational 6 long-term permanently stacked plots. They were established by Edmund Granger and Francois Smith in 1979. And as I've mentioned, they are distributed across high and low altitudes, so 1 and 3. It's those 2 ones, they're just right next to the road. And you also have plots 4 to 6, the low altitude plots. So as I've mentioned, the initial monitoring took place from 1979 to 1993. And it was followed up So there was a stop in the monitoring. And then Tim O'Connor picked it up from 2014 to 2017. And all of the plants that were there, but when they were monitoring, are marked with these numbered tags to ensure that they were counted only once, but also to make sure that if we are doing long-term monitoring, we could always go back to the same plant and we do the same measurements. So what are we collecting? We are, for the seedlings, we'll collect, we're measuring the height. And then for adults, so we measure the height of the adult, the canopy condition. So that's the whole canopy. We first look at the whole canopy, and then we look at what percentage of that canopy has been lost to fire. And then we look at we count the number of branches, the number of flowers, as well as the basal circumference. And we measure also the height it's where we measured the basal circumference. We also look at the fire height damage. So all of this canopy was charred by fire. We look at if there's a scar on the bark somewhere. We look at the fire scar depth, so we measure it. The data, sorry, I forgot to mention that this is a proposal study. We haven't conducted any, we've done half a plot of fieldwork. So we will get some of the data from Ezemvelo for fire history as well as satellite data. I've also inherited some of the data from 1979 to 1993 from Ed and Francois. And the climate data, we're planning to get it from there's a nearby weather station in Himville. Okay, continuing on the data collection. So how are we gonna measure the rock cover or the microhabitat is we'll be looking at, I thought it was gonna be a short presentation. We'll be looking at the rock cover or the rock at a 1 meter radius distance to the closest grass edge. And we'll do this both for adults and for seedlings or juveniles. And also I've also forgot to mention that the juveniles, we're classifying them as trees or species that are 1.2 meters high or below 1.25. They have to have a radius, basal circumference of 4 centimeters or less, as well as no flower heads. Okay, so in conclusion, the project contributes to a deeper ecological understanding of how environmental variability and disturbances like fire and influence the distribution and survivals of population dynamics of plant species in higher altitude grasslands. And by incorporating this historical data, Sayan, we love long-term data and long-term monitoring, the study supports ongoing efforts to track ecological changes and adapt conservation and management strategies in fire-prone habitats. Hopefully next year, I'll be back here to tell you what we find. Thank you.
Thank you, Londiwe. We've got time for a question from the audience. Michelle.
Hi, Londiwe. You said you're going to measure fire intensity. Did I hear correctly? Can you get that information from the satellite imagery?
So if we get the weather data as well as the fire data, we can try to estimate the intensity.
Sue?
Can you give us a hint of what you saw in your first studies? Was it easy to relocate these things, and maybe some perspectives on the studies that Tim and Ed did in the past?
So the plots were quite easy to find. They're still there permanently. What we find there was that there's practically no more adult trees. There was a fire in 2016 after the mega drought that almost took out all adults. So in some plots they are scattered here and there, but there's been a few seedlings that we've seen. It's just interesting to see how the recruitment process goes with those.
Earth.
I guess relating to the other previous question as well, are slope and orientation a factor in these plots, or do they all face more or less in the same direction and have similar slopes, because that can also affect fire intensity?
So no, the high altitude are facing that way. I'm not sure what slope that is, and the other one are facing that way, but they're opposite. Sorry, I'm not sure, but the slopes are different. The high altitude ones face this side of the road, and the other ones face that side of the road. And the other ones are quite in a slopey area. Paul's going to help me answer the question.
Are really big.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the slope is very...
Can I go back to the... Yeah, the plots are big, but they're not the same size. Others are bigger than others. I think the biggest one is 5,100 and something square kilometers.
Wow.
I think so. Yeah, they're quite big.
Is that one last question there?
Too many questions.
Thank you. It's not necessarily a question, it's contribution or advice for fire intensity detection. You can use Sentinel-derived fire index ratio. So it gives quite high resolution fire intensity data. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for those questions and inputs, and I'm sure you'd be happy to catch Londiwe over lunch. Our next speaker is Bridgette Mc Millan from Rhodes University, and she's working on the effect of fire on grasses in the Kalahari. Please don't fall before you start. There's your footer and there's your...
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to share with you some of my research, which has been focusing on the post-fire recovery of Kalahari grasses. So fire is not just a destructive force. In savannas, it is a natural process that has been shaping the ecosystem for millennia. In fact, savannas are synonymous with fire as they have evolved under periodic burning. Fires play a pivotal role in maintaining the balance and ensuring the structure and biodiversity and productivity of these landscapes. The fuel of these fires is primarily grass biomass. The quantity and quality of these biomass is determined by rainfall events. In wetter years, you have a greater biomass buildup, leading to more intense and widespread fires. While in your drier years, you have a reduction in biomass buildup, leading to lower intensity fires. The flammability of these grasses is determined by their traits like their chemical composition, moisture content, and structure. These traits directly impact how a fire spreads and the intensity of the fire. Much research has been focused in mesic savannas. However, this focus is limited in semi-arid and arid savannas, which leads to the aim of my project, which is to determine the relationship between climate, grass composition, and fire behavior to gain a better understanding of how fire risk varies in space and time with changing climates in the Kalahari. So today I'm going to tell you about my one objective of fire recovery, and I have divided this into 3 mini objectives. The first is to see how the grass population on a whole recovers, how individual species recover, and then how the community dynamics change on and off fire scars. The goal of this objective is to understand how grasses recover after fire and how rainfall influences this recovery after time. So my study site is the Kalahari Reserve in the Northern Cape. It is South Africa's largest privately owned game reserve, spanning over 114,000 hectares. The reserve experiences an average of 200 to 300 millimeters of rain per year and experiences temperatures of above 45 degrees and below -5. So at Tshwalu, I am working on 9 fires that span from 2021 to early 2024. These fires occur on 5 distinct habitat types. The dots on this the map here are 54 transects that I established throughout the reserve. So each fire scar has 6 transects in total, 3 on the fire scar and 3 corresponding off the fire scar. Each transect is X-shaped and 30 meters in length, where I have established 1 square meter quadrants 3 meters along the arms. In each quadrant, I identified which species is present, and then I measured traits like their new biomass, their old biomass, foliage height, crown circumference, and gave each individual a herbivory score of 1 to 5. I also recorded environmental variables like how much bare soil was in the plot and how much litter accumulation there was. So here's some images of the different transects that we did. And you can see that there is some similarity in the vegetation, but there is also variability. Now, these are the unburned transects, but you can see the stark contrast of our burned transects. Some of the transects are in recovery, but some are as bare as when they were burnt. So this graph demonstrates the monthly rainfall the reserve received from 2017 to 2024. As you can see, it's quite cyclic. However, there were large high rainfall years in 2020 and 2021. This led to a high biomass build-up of the grass species, which I believe is the fuel for the fires that occurred in 2021 to 2024. This is the estimated post-fire rainfall per scar. So this is the amount of rainfall each fire scar received during the recovery period. So what I did was I looked at the post-fire recovery from 3 angles. The first is that I looked at the biomass and the growth traits, how they recovered over time with mixed models, where I compared the burnt and unburned transects every 6 months. And then I dived deeper and I looked at how the individual species recovered. And then I compared the community compositions on and off the fire scar with a multivariate analysis. So let's look at our first one is how did the grass species recover on a whole? So this graph is the estimated new biomass growth on the scars. The scale is for 42 months and the new biomass. So the new biomass here is a representation of the amount of forage available on the plots. So if we look at our plots, as expected, our unburned transects had higher new biomass growth compared to our burned transects. But over time, it took about 18 months for the burned transects to have an equal amount of new biomass and overtake that of the unburned transects. If we look at our old biomass growth, this variable represents the amount of the previous season's growth or the fire risk on the plots. And again, as expected, the unburned transects have a higher accumulation in the beginning. And as time goes on, it took about 36 months for the burned transects to equal and overtake the unburned transects. And now if we look at our foliage height, which also is representative of the amount of forage available, it follows a similar trend as our new biomass. However, it took about 24 months this time for the heights of the burned transects to equal and overtake the heights of the unburned transects. And our last factor is our crown circumference. Again, it's a representation of the forage available, and it took, again, about 24 months for the crown circumferences of the burned transects to equal and overtake the circumferences of the unburned transects. So did the biomass recover after a fire? Yes, but the process was complex. The factors associated with the grazing value recovered relatively quickly, reaching the pre-fire levels in between 18 and 24 months, while the factors related to the fuel load or the fire risk recovered more slowly and only returned to pre-fire levels within 36 months. So our next objective is which species bounced back the fastest. So this graph represents the monthly recovery rates of each species. As you can see here, that only 2 species had a significantly positive interaction with the fire. So Aerogrossus pallens had about a 6% new biomass increase per month, while the Aristida meridionalis had about a 5% new biomass increase per month. Now, when we go to our next factor of the height, we can see only 1 species had a positive reaction with the fire. And again, that was Aerogrossus pallens, where it had about a 6% height increase per month. So what did we learn here is that the Aerogrossus pallens showed the strongest post-fire recovery as it had a significant increase in new biomass and height growth. Aristida meridionalis also responded positively, and it had an increase in new biomass growth after the fire. However, I must also mention that there was no significant change in the crown circumference recovery in any of the species that I studied. And now our final objective is how the community composition changed on and off the fire scars. So this graph represents the distribution of the plant species across the different sites. As you can see here, these 2 axes explain about 70% of the variation. So let's look at our first clustering. We have a clustering around our Aerogrossus pallens species, and this is fires 3, 4, and 6. We can also see here that these fires are associated with quite high herbivory levels. So these fires were on the shrubveld and bushveld vegetation, which could be a reason why they have such high herbivory. And speaking of herbivory levels, I did a quick analysis to see if there was any significant differences between the herbivory scores on and off the fire scars. And as we can see here, for Aristida stipitata, Centropodia glauci, Aerogrossus pallens, and Stipagrossus uniplumis, there were significant differences between the herbivories. In our next clustering, we can see we have fires 1, 2, 5, and 8. They clustered around 2 species, Aristida congesta and Schmidtia kalahariensis. These 2 species are known pioneers and are often associated with disturbance, which aligns with them being near our burned plots. So these fires occurred on the shrub felds and dune felds and the bushveld types. So we can see here that fire may have changed the conditions of the area to favor these fast-growing colonizing species. And in our last clustering here, we can see there's a large cluster around our species Stipagrossus uniplumis, and this is for fires 1, 2, 6, 8, and 9. And what's interesting here with this clustering is it seems to be a transition point where it goes from dominance of Stipagrossus uniplumis in your unburned transects to the dominance of other species in their burned transects. And these fires occurred on the shrubveld, duneveld, and bushveld habitat types. So what did we learn here with the community dynamics is that the species distributions varied by site and is influenced by the fire and environmental factors. There was clustering around the species of Aerogrossus pallens, Aristida congesta, and Schmidtia kalahariensis. And the clustering around the species Stipagrossus uniplumis shows that there is a post-fire species turnover. So my study provides valuable insights into how the plant community responds to fire. It highlights the resilience of some of the species and the post-fire dominant changes in others. My findings also have important implications for land management, as it shows that fire can be used as a tool to strategically maintain biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem. By identifying the vulnerable and resilient species, we can it can aid in controlled burn planning and habitat restoration efforts. I'd like to thank the Rhodes University, the Londiwe Reserve, and all the field assistants that helped me collect all this data. Any questions?
Thanks, Bridgette. Who's got some questions? Lorraine, and then.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Maybe two quick questions. The one was, you didn't mention, but you said that it was a private game reserve. How did all those fires start?
Lightning. These were all lightning strikes.
Okay. And secondly, when you talked about plant height and you mentioned the positive correlation with species like Erograssus pallens and Aristida meridionalis, but those are, in my opinion, both unpalatable species. But you didn't talk about these at the bottom, where Digitaria and Centropodia glauca, which are the palatable species, they seem to become smaller in size. So I'm just scared that when you talk about herbivory, that you mentioned all these the species that correspond positively to the fire, but they're all unpalatable species.
Yes, so I only spoke about the ones that had significant interactions now, but I will be going deeper into looking at their recoveries. But what I'm assuming, and I've seen in the field with Erograssus pallens, is that the small individuals, the newly growth Erograssus pallens, is the ones that the herbivores are eating. While and then again, I'm going to go into more detail about the Centropodia glauca and all the other palatable stuff.
Thanks. Is SWALU doing controlled burns across the reserve, or are they planning to with this kind of data?
So we were invited into Tswalu to investigate the effects of fire to see if they need to include fire as a management practice. So it's still very early days on if they are going to include fire, but hopefully this research will help them decide if they are going to do controlled burns or not. Any other questions? At the back there.
In your objective one, your graphics, your trend lines, you've got like points right on the trend line and as suggesting a perfect correlation. I think it'd be better to actually put some of the data dispersion along that trend line to be able to see what they are, and then just have the trend line without those points.
Yes.
It's just a suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually going to go do resampling in November, and I'm going to add that data into these new, and then I'll, like you suggested, put a distribution of the trends.
Thanks. There's a question right at the back, further back than Urs.
Thank you for an interesting talk. Maybe I missed it. You mentioned herbivory towards the end. To what an extent do you think it affects the recovery of the grasses? When after fire, the grasses that come up are probably green flush, and herbivores will go towards it. And how long, to what an extent does it affect how long do they recover?
So I do believe herbivory has some impact on the regrowth and palatability of these grasses. However, the fires that I worked on were small in the grand scheme of the whole reserve. So there would be a limited amount of herbivores due to territory and stuff on these fire scars. So I don't think it would have a great impact if you look at a broader scope of the whole reserve, but it definitely does impact their recoveries on the fire scars themselves.
All right, thanks everyone for the questions, and thank you, Bridgette. Our next presenter, give her a hand. Our next presenter is Devan McGranahan, also in the US, and also, I believe, presenting a pre-recorded presentation.
Hi, everyone. While I sure wish I was there in person to help you all celebrate the 60th anniversary of the GSSA, I appreciate this opportunity to do so virtually. On that, I'd like to point out that this work was done while I was employed by North Dakota State University, and my talk today is not really representing either current or former employers, but I'm just here as a member of the GSSA, happy to join you. going to be talking today about fire grazing and the fire grazing interaction, and focusing specifically on how the shifting mosaic of recently burned patches and animal responses to that high quality forage move animals around through the landscape. Although the natural version of this is kind of shown in this cartoon with being bounded by streams or natural rock outcroppings, areas where fire would just fail to spread beyond that to define the patch. We could create this with what's called patch burning, using prescribed fire and pre-made fire breaks to subdivide a burn unit or a pasture into what we would call patches. Sometimes down there you would call block burning. Now, I went over some of these benefits of fire for livestock production and rangeland systems. Last year, Kevin was concerned that because it was so cold at Kalahari Dam, maybe people weren't really remembering so much, so I thought we should have a bit of a refresher here. We've shown how most recently burned areas have the highest plant available nitrogen in the soil and even have higher soil carbon. The forage itself had higher mineral content, which could potentially reduce the inputs that ranchers need to put into their herds out on rangelands. And overall, we saw improved forage nutritive value, just higher crude protein, lower lignin fiber, higher digestibility, higher net energy for maintenance and for lactation in these burned areas. And in the end, we saw overall greater weight gains in animals on pastures that had prescribed fire over the course of the grazing season. We had 4 pasture replicates in each of 3 grazing systems. We had the patch burning system where we had 1/4 of the pasture, a 16-hectare patch, was burned in the spring. And then cattle were allowed to just go across the whole pasture over the course of the grazing season. We had what we call a continuous grazing treatment, which was just no fire, but no internal fences. Animals were allowed to just go wherever they wanted in that pasture. And then we had a modified twice over rotational system. The twice over part is we had 4 paddocks in pasture, and animals would graze each paddock twice during the growing season. But in a given year, we would only use 3 of the 4 paddocks that the pasture had been divided into. Everything had the same number of animals. They're from the same herd, about 22 pairs, Black Angus with their calves, from May until October, which is our grazing season in the Northern Hemisphere. In the rotational system, we had those same number of animals, but they were confined to 1/4 of the pasture at a time to affect that slightly higher stocking density that you see with rotational systems. We conducted our study really at the scale of the feeding station, which is the idea of where a cow stands and puts her face down, what she sees and has available to eat. So we were studying these with 1/4 meter squared quadrats spread across the landscape within patches and throughout the pastures. And we visit these monthly and clip. We use the tried and true method of just counting cow pies, fecal pats, dung around those quadrats. And the idea being simply that where an animal is where an animal poops. And so we're able to get insight into their spatial distribution by the fact that if there's more poop over here, then those cows have spent more time there than they have in another part. This is a selection index that's just based on the relative distribution of fecal pats or cow pies around the feeding stations across the pasture through these 4 grazing seasons. Anything above 1 with the dotted line here is showing a preference, and anything below 1 is showing a selection against those areas for grazing. And we can see a very strong preference for the recently burned areas in patch burned pastures throughout the grazing season. Now let's focus on the scale of the feeding station. On this graph along the bottom, you see this forage quality index, which is derived from multidimensional scaling ordination, and use the first dimension of that, which explained the most variation in all those measures, to be just this index of forage composition or forage quality. So you can see the distribution of those across all of the pastures of these 3 different management types. And then these plotted lines are a predictive regression of the quality and how cattle are responding in terms of fecal fat density to feeding stations of various quality. And generally you see this upward slope, which makes sense that animals are choosing areas that have higher forage quality. But notice this red line, which is the rotational grazing system, and the conventional wisdom that when these animals are put into higher density, that they're supposed to not be selecting for areas of higher forage quality. And this line is different from the others in that it is shifted up. You can see the higher intercept that reflects the higher density, but we have the same slope showing that they are still exercising selectivity for areas within the single paddock that have higher forage quality, which is something that we were specifically trying to override with the rotational grazing. What I've called grazing hotspots, areas where cattle are focusing their grazing and how they move around in space and in time over the 4 years in the patch burn pastures versus these continuously grazed pastures. On the bottom axis, you see again that same forage quality index. What we're plotting here is variability in a single point over the 4 years. So a low value here doesn't show low forage quality. A low value here shows low variability in the forage quality at a given point. So one of those feeding stations, one of those quadrats out on the landscape over the course of 4 years in the continuously grazed pastures didn't vary very much. And concordantly, spatial preference didn't change much either. So you can essentially interpret this as areas with high forage quality continuously had high forage quality from year to year across those 4 years in the continuously grazed pastures. And we can assume then in there that areas with low forage quality stayed the same and were not visited by animals at all during the years, which shows underutilization of those areas. Conversely, in the pastures that had patch burns, we see very high variability in both forage quality and in spatial preference. So a single point on the landscape went through all the levels of forage quality and was heavily grazed and was then ignored by animals, showing this high variability in both of these measures. So here's an actual map of one of those pastures. You can see the feeding stations that we've measured. The white squares are the little quadrats that we put around. The colors are the ecological sites. You can see it's very variable in terms of inherent heterogeneity in these pastures. The dotted lines are the patches, and the patch burn pastures, these would actually be plowed and we would burn off those, and those would be the 16-hectare patch burns in the experiment. And as I said about the continuously grazed ones, these are just magic lines that live in GIS. They're not actually out there on the landscape, and cattle aren't aware of them. And some of the conventional wisdom about the natural impulses of grazers is, as we've seen already, they're likely to use areas that they prefer year in and year out, and avoid areas that they don't like every year, and only fire so far is able to override that. But here we're going to test the relative effect of soils to see whether we can override some of this inherent heterogeneity, some of the inherent environmental variability that animals are using to make their foraging decisions. Can we override that with our top-down disturbance? And what we see is, yes, our patch burns, our squares, can override the squiggles of inherent heterogeneity in the environment. What I'm showing here are the relative contributions of each of these terms, the patches and the ecological sites, in random effect models where we're using variance partitioning to show the relative effect of each of these. So the y-axes here are variation. It's not how high or low the forage quantity is or the grazer distribution is. It is how variable they are under these different conditions, patches or ecological sites, without fire and with fire. Forage quantity is a full-on interaction where we actually see switching. Ecological sites are the driver of preference above patches. So we would expect to see that without fire, the ecological sites are driving the variability in how much forage is there, productive sites and low productivity sites. However, with fire, it definitely overrides, and we see that switching. We see that quantity is driven by that time since fire gradient and forage being able to grow up after it has been burned. We see a very steep increase in the variability and forage quality explained by patch burning because of that same time since fire thing that we've been seeing, where the forage nutritive value of burned areas is consistently much greater than unburned areas. So obviously the patchiness of that fire history is going to drive variability in forage quality. And we see in the bottom here that grazers respond to this. They don't have much of a choice on patches versus ecological sites. They're relatively the same. Again, those patches don't exist. They're on the left at the bottom in the unburned, continuously grazed pastures. But once you get into the patch burning, we really see that time since fire, the patchiness imposed by our prescribed fire program is what's driving their distribution. And patches, or the ecological sites rather, are lower and actually decline in the patch burning. So we come from this showing that we are able to override the inherent heterogeneity of rangeland, extensive rangeland ecosystems with patch burning. We aren't just moving their grazing hotspots around, but we're actually overcoming some of the environmental drivers that lead to the establishment of hotspots in the absence of fire. So the point of all this is that we can confirm that patch burn grazing creates a shifting mosaic, and it can even override some of the inherent variability that would create a non-shifting mosaic, a static mosaic in the landscape of hotspots being used and reused. Patch burning stirs that up and moves the animals around in the landscape because we see this heterogeneity in the forage resources, and we see cattle responding both at the pasture scale in terms of what patches they're choosing, but then also at the feeding station scale, and they're responding to that high quality forage that's in the recently burned areas. And so what I think we can use from this in terms of applied and adaptive management is we can take advantage of the shifting mosaic as a grazing management practice. We get rest on much of the landscape in a given year by drawing animals into the areas that have the highest forage quality. We're creating more areas at a patch level, and not just feeding station to feeding station. We're creating broad areas of a pasture that has higher quality forage that persists through the grazing season. So yes, the actual available forage at a given time at a given feeding station is lower in the patch burn areas because they've been burned and they've been repeatedly grazed. What is available is higher quality, and it is available at that higher quality throughout the grazing season. And because we got this spatial distribution that not only creates high quality grazing here and rest over here, we have variability in species composition and specifically plant species structure that gives us benefits to biodiversity through this heterogeneous environment for nesting and cover for birds and pollinator resources. But because prescribed fire is an inherent part of this process, we see the benefits to soil health as well. And we're able to get all of this without internal fencing and without moving water around and all the costs of setting up these systems and maintaining them. I think that we could look at using prescribed fire as a specific grazing management practice that has all of these marginal cost saving benefits in addition to the biodiversity benefits. Now, there are some barriers to starting up on prescribed fire. Ranchers are familiar with building fence. They're not particularly familiar with setting fires. But once that culture takes hold and people are working together to get their burns done, that initial investment will be returned on through these potential marginal gains. And at the very least, if we're not doing prescribed fire on our own ranches, we should be using some of these data to be rethinking how we use areas that have burned by wildfire. There's a conventional wisdom that those areas are particularly sensitive following a wildfire and that grazing should be held off for a while. But I think what we're seeing here is no, we need to take advantage of the mosaic on the landscape that is created by fire, whether prescribed or otherwise. And that is high quality forage out there that we should be using. And if we're able to move animals off that in subsequent seasons and allow that area to recover and rest, we're going to have long-term sustainability in our rangeland ecosystems. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to take part in the Congress with you all, even if it is from afar. So if I am up and there is any time, I'd love to entertain any questions. But either way, I hope you just enjoy the Congress, and I hope to see you in the future soon. Hi, everyone. While I sure wish I was there in person to help you.
All right. Are you up, Devan? We
I am up
terribly. And since you did have to drag yourself out of bed a little on the early side, we'd really appreciate some questions for Devan. Yes, Richard?
Hi, Devan.
How's it?
Yep, nice talk. And but I'm just wondering, to what degree do the non-burned areas keep the livestock off? Because to me, just a little bit of grazing in those non-burned areas messes up the resting program. So I'm not convinced that patch burning can, really get the proper resting into the unburned areas, without trying to use fences.
We see substantial avoidance throughout the grazing season in unburned patches. That's some of the original data that I presented last year that's in Megan Wanchuk's Ag Ecosystems Environment paper. That selectivity index is just, that's just down. They're not using the unburned areas.
Thanks. Any other questions? It wouldn't be the same without Urs asking a question. So there we go. Roving mic is on its way.
Hey, Devan, well done for being up at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's impressive. And only having had one glass of brandy, I'll just tell the audience that you said so. Anyway.
No secrets with Urs.
No, we shouldn't have secrets. Anyway, I'm just wondering about issues of scale. One of the things with patch burning, often people say, well, you can do this at ranch scale, small scale. But I wonder, to what extent the effect of having this pyroherbivory approach is actually effective in avoidance of other areas at smaller property scales.
So are you questioning whether the scale that I presented is larger than you're asking about or smaller than you're asking about or finer?
Sorry, I had to get another mic. I'm not sure what the scale was that you were operating at. It's probably smaller. I don't know. I'm just thinking about at the ranch scale, to what extent can we use this kind of approach on smaller properties versus larger properties? One argument I've always had with Sam is that on smaller properties, this kind of approach may not be very practical for landowners. And particularly in areas where people—
Well, these pastures were, I can't do metric at this time of the day, but those were 160 acres. So what was that, like 40 something or 65 hectares was the experimental unit with 16 hectare burns. So like for us, that for the Northern Plains, that's pretty small, but maybe standard for, well, for that area in North Dakota to subdivide a section into 4 pastures would be, that is, I mean, that is ranch scale. That I'd say that for that region, that is exactly ranch scale. And I do think that it is downscalable. And aside from everything presented, I think that and I remember this debate from last year, the grazing intensity or stocking rate or whatever, it's matching that offtake to what's being produced by that burned patch. That's what scales. So to me, it's not so much a spatial extent scaling issue as a herbivory intensity scaling issue. And you can have a nice lush green burn patch grow ahead of animals if there aren't sufficient number of animals to keep that grazing lawn, as you know, South Africans would call it, down. The grazing hotspots need to keep that stature low. So I think the biggest risk in scaling is actually burning too large of an area for the grazing pressure you're able to deliver or manage subsequently. And then turnout time is a big issue too. As you get, as I'm learning in the Northern Plains, as you get more C3 grasses that are growing up earlier and heading out and ceasing growth, having cattle on those pastures and biting those grasses early before they head out is key to productivity, and which is kind of different than some of the conventional wisdom on management is to let grass grow up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Big hand for
Thank you
for dragging himself out of bed early and giving us question time.
Well, I'm going right back to bed. We'll talk to y'all later.
All right, thank you. We now left with a couple of 5-minute talks. I just wanted to check quickly, Eric Stock, who's in the program to give the second one of those, is not here, but he does have a co-author. Is Heidi Kutsia here? Doesn't look like it. All right, so we are down to 2 5-minute talks, starting with Seriphium Moss from University of Fort Hare. And she's going to be telling us about functional trait responses of C4 grasses to different fire frequencies. Please, the floor is yours.
Greetings to the house at large. I am Seriphium Moss. My research presentation is titled Functional Traits Response of Bunch Grasses along the gradient of fire frequencies in semi-arid savannas of the Eastern Cape. Fires have been a vital part of South African rangelands for hundreds of years. Over time, scientists and farmers developed techniques to sustainably manage pastures using fire. However, the optimum fire frequency that promotes regeneration and maximizes productivity of bunch grasses is unknown, and it's also unclear how other grass species. It's also unclear how will various grass species persist under future fire frequencies driven by climate change. As you can see in this diagram, this was an experimental layout of the UFH fire trials located in Raymond Mhlaba. Hence, but in this study, sexennial band and triennial were excluded. In each of these plots, 4 grass species, dominant grass species were selected, and of which in this case, it was the Mediterranean Rasporeborus fumbiatus, Sibobacon prolinotis, and Digitaria. At 20, 40, 60, and 80 meter plots along a transect, they were identified within a radius of 5 meters, and the productivity, the growth, and reproductive traits were determined. The analysis of variance was determined using the general linear model as follows, and the level of significance was tested at p is less or equals to 0.05. using Tukey test. On these results, for both height and the total biomass, there was no significant effect of fire frequency and the interaction between the fire frequency and the species. However, there was a significant effect between the species. Coming to tiller production, as you can see, the Mediterranean have the highest numbers of tillers across all treatments. In the study, the analysis proved that the Mediterranean, the study proved that for tiller production, there was no significant effect between the treatment and the fire frequency and the species, but there was a significant effect within the species. Coming to reproductive tillers, the analysis proved that there was no significant effect between the fire frequencies, the interaction between the fire frequencies and the species alone. As you can see in this graph, for biennial and quadrennial band, the Mediterranean produced twice as more tillers compared to other species. We then concluded that the functional traits response of bunch grasses along the gradient of fire frequencies varied by species. And notable palatable grasses, the Mediterranean indicated that it persisted through tiller regeneration with more tillers reaching reproduction. We therefore concluded that annual fires proved to be detrimental to plant recovery by reducing tillering and flowering, signifying a need to prevent them. And also I would like to acknowledge the GSSA for giving me this opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions for Sinanamtla? Are there any questions for Sinanamtla? Yes, Michelle.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering whether you saw any prostrate growing grasses in your plot. I know you didn't look at them, but like something growing along the ground, like cyanodon, dactylon, or anything like that. And whether those, I know you didn't look at that, but whether you thought about whether those could have been influenced by fires.
Thank you for the question. For future researches, I hope to look at them to more species that I didn't look at. For this study, I simply concentrated on only the follow selected bunch grasses, which is the bunch grasses. Yeah.
Great. Is there one more? Thanks, Sinanamtla. Well done. And we have one final 5-minute talk by Jubilant Sithole from the University of Free State, who is looking at post-fire community composition of Drakensberg, Amatola, Afromontane, Fynbos. Floor is yours. There's your little toy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jubilant Sithole, and today I'll be presenting on post-fire community composition of the GD6 Fynbos before and after 2023 fire. So as we know, so during my master's, I confirmed the presence of Fynbos components within the grassland and therefore extended the mapping section of those species. So the map on the left indicate the 2 mappings that were done by Musina and Rutherford and the one that was proposed by Protea, as well as the plots that I surveyed. I therefore extended the map into a one big map to cover all the plots as they created the same communities. So in October 1st, 2023 and days thereafter, there was an extensive fire that broke out within the park, which is in Golden Gate Highlands National Park, which then created an opportunity for me to see how the Fynbos communities would recover after fire. And the map here just indicates the sections that were burned within the park, which includes the sections that I surveyed for my master's. So we know that grassland and fynbos are both fire-driven ecosystems, but there's a discrepancy between when these ecosystems should burn. And therefore, the regular burning of the grasslands may affect the fynbos components within the grasslands. Although fire is an important factor for vegetation structure and composition, its effects may differ between the two ecosystems due to the different fire frequency, intensity, and type, as well as the season in which the fire should occur. So the fynbos usually burns every 3 to 10 years, with the grasslands burning every 1 to 4 years. And the fynbos in this case is similar to the Renosterfeld fynbos, which experiences fire during the dry summer seasons, which is in contrast with the Golden Gate Highlands National Park, where fires usually occur during the dry winter months. So in order to achieve my results, sample plots were laid on 3 different transects within the Golden Gate Highlands National Park on the previously sampled plots, and this will be done on 2 more consecutive seasons. The Brundtland-Kekaba abundance scale was used to record all the species within the park with a scale of 10 by 10 meters with 10 meter spaces in between. And then the data that was collected in the field was captured in VegCap, where a twin span analysis was conducted. So for the results, in 2023, as you can see in the picture on the left, there were 2 communities with 4 sub-communities and 4 variants that were found during the phytosociological study. The grassland and fynbos species were dominating these communities, with Passerina montana dominating the communities. And then in 2025, which was after the 2023 fire, there were 2 communities with 5 sub-communities, and these communities were dominated by grassland species. However, Passerina montana was still found in the study, but compared to 2023, it was only present as juvenile plants, as most of the adult plants burned during the fire. To conclude, I can say that fire did alter the dominant species in those communities, and therefore this study was done to determine the time it would take for Passerina montana to be dominant again within those communities. So the study will then provide baseline data on the effect of fire on GD6 composition, as well as provide the Golden Gate Highlands National Park with information on fire as an ecosystem driver. Currently, the park doesn't have any information on the effect of fire on the fynbos vegetation, and therefore the study will provide the park with that particular information. And then for future studies, I would recommend that the fire regime of the park be studied, as currently there is no studies done within the Golden Gate Highlands National Park on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jubilant. Are there any questions from the floor? Please don't run away, because I do still have one important housekeeping announcement. Any question? Yes, Michelle?
Thank you. That was interesting. Grassland species generally survive fires, whereas in fynbos you tend to have reseeders and resprouters. Do you have any idea whether the fynbos species that you found before the fire, whether they are reseeders or resprouters? Did you find any evidence for resprouting in the fynbos elements that you had there?
I think the ones there were reseeders. There were no any proteas within those plots that I surveyed, so I'm not really sure if there are also resprouters there.
Anyone else? Great. A big hand to Jubilant and also to all our other speakers. I think it's been a fantastic session taking us around the world.